I'm more like a standing and talking person, so I'm going to hold this like this. To start, my name is Marius. I come from Timișoara, Romania, not very far away. I'm a WordPress developer, and I've been experimenting with WordPress for about 3 years now, and I can say that I learn new stuff every day. Since I work in the support team at Presslabs, Presslabs is a hosting company which is dedicated to WordPress publishers. And on a daily basis, we come across a lot of plugins that are not really implemented as they should be, and that not go by certain coding standards that us WordPress developers are actually used to. So this is why I chose the topic of universal coding for this meet. I've structured the presentation in a series of ideas that I consider to be taken into consideration when starting to write a plugin or a theme. And I've structured my presentation into 3 main topics, and we'll talk about them when we get to them. So for starters, what should we understand by writing WordPress code that's universal? Mainly, it all comes down to writing code that does not put the WordPress administrator into difficulty when he has to migrate the site from one hosting environment to another. Basically, for example, he might think of optimizing the performance of the site. So he chooses to migrate the site from a regular hosting system to a hosting system that uses different cache layers and optimization techniques. Once he does this and the plugin is not really compatible with this kind of the behavior, he cannot really take advantage of what the new hosting environment has to offer. Also, plugins oftentimes come into conflict with one another, and at the same time it might happen that plugins or themes are implemented in such a manner that if an article suddenly becomes super popular and you get a high traffic boost, your site might crash. So let's start. Firstly, I'd like to go through some general do's and don'ts when writing code. And I'll start with something that we've really come across when debugging our client's code. In order to explain the idea of this slide, I'd have to describe the environment at Presslabs. We have the backend. The WP admin is decoupled from the front end, and it's always served from an HTTPS protocol. And also the domain differs from what the client would choose as the main domain of the site. So we have this area grayed out in the admin panel, as the clients have to configure them from our own administration panel, and they can switch from one domain to another. And what we actually do is that we hook into the site URL and home URL functions, and we filter out the values that should be displayed for the backend URL and for the front-end URL. And we've noticed that a lot of plugins just take the value of the options from the options table, mainly the site URL and the home options, which leads to a bunch of problems, mainly when trying to activate plugin licenses, since the plugin sends to the server handling the plugin licenses a certain URL. And then, for example, if the client chooses to migrate to our environment where the backend is decoupled and is served from a different domain, the license might appear as having already been validated, and thus the new request appearing as a new attempt to license a new copy of the plugin. Also, we've noticed that when trying to register with different services, plugins tend to send a callback URL so that the client can be later return to his site once he's confirmed with the API of the service that it's in use. And also that can differ, which can lead to problems. And also, many teams often have a very nicely arranged administration panel, loading assets such as the CSS files, the JavaScript, and the images. And since our backends run always on HTTPS, while the front end might also run on HTTPS but can run on HTTP, those assets are blocked by the browser, since they will appear as being loaded from an unsecure endpoint. So mainly the idea would be that it's better to use the site URL and home URL functions instead of choosing the unfiltered values. The second idea I would like to bring up is regarding the PHP calls to files other than, for example, admin Ajax PHP. Oftentimes we see such includes at the beginning of a PHP file, which is loaded, for example, asynchronously to print some CSS or JavaScript code that can be dynamically manipulated. And the problem with such declarations as we have here is that the point at which the WordPress install resides can vary. Thus, the //// might not match from one plugin setup, from one WordPress setup to another, thus leading the PHP file not being able to load the entire WordPress environment and access its functions. Mainly, what would be recommended to do here is to use the admin Ajax PHP and the other interfaces that WordPress has to offer. As well as, if we are allowed, if the use case that we're trying to implement allows us, try to implement some custom URLs by defining our own rewrite rules. For example, if we have a CSS asset that we would like to dynamically modify from what the administrator configures in the admin panel, we can just generate the code that's associated to that CSS asset and store it at a certain URL, thus serving it always from that URL without having the necessity of running to the PHP code itself. This is especially helpful if we're using an environment that employs cache in order to optimize the performance of the site. Now, oftentimes I've encountered in plugins the $request variable, which oftentimes can be quite confusing, as it's not really certain from which type of request the data is received. So I personally consider that it's best to just be straightforward and use the get or post variables in order to ease the debugging if the developer will get there. Now, of course, a site can make use of a lot of plugins and themes, and the WordPress itself has its own interface offering different functions. So it's high likelihood that function names might clash. So recommendations would be that we use well-defined namespaces, we use authentic prefixes in order to make sure that our functions, our classes are really unique in the way they are named, and also to avoid WP underscore, because you never know if the function that you've implemented will actually get to be replicated within the WordPress core somewhere in the future. Of course, a good practice would be to just stuff all your functions inside a class and then instantiate your class using a global variable, and then you'll just have to make sure that the class and the global variable are very well prefixed to make them unique. Now, eval is one of the dangerous good things that PHP has to offer, so to say, in that it depends very much on the way that the plugin and the theme is implemented and the degree to which the eval function is exposed to user input. So eval might be the right choice when it comes to implementing a certain functionality, but we really have to make sure that we have total control upon what we insert into the body of the eval call itself. I don't recommend using eval or create functions, since debugging also would be really difficult for the person that is to debug, as you are never really certain what exactly could be the code that executes there. And also, create function has some problems regarding performance when the function that it creates actually gets to run. Now, custom tables in database are not necessarily a bad thing, since they might just offer what WordPress lacks. But at the same time, when we decide to use an approach that creates the own tables associated to a plugin or to a theme install, we really have to make sure that we clean up after ourselves. Mainly if the user chooses not to use our plugin anymore, we just offer functionality which does sort of an uninstall of the tables that we've created. In my team, we've run across several sites that have some history of publishing behind. And when we had a look at their database, in PHPMyAdmin, there were like 5 pages of tables that were leftovers from different plugins that they'd installed a long time. So this is a lot of clutter, and it's a lot of clutter that's really unnecessary, especially if you have a plugin which creates a lot of entries for each article. And if you write a lot of articles and you stop using that plugin, then you'll just have the table with a lot of content within it just stand there and not be used at all. Of course, when we are to write a piece of code, we have to make sure that in case it doesn't cover absolutely all use cases that a client or a user might come across, we make it extensible. Oftentimes, we've seen clients that wanted to make their site look different, and in order to do that, we had to go into the plugin, alter its functionality. Then we realized that actually what we modified in the plugin would be useful, and we had to make a suggestion to the plugin developer to include our fix in the next release. But this doesn't always happen, so we get to implement the fix, then the client relentlessly just updates the plugin, and since the fix is not included with the update, he calls us and he says, hey man, you just fixed something that it doesn't work, and then we have to go again and apply the fix and so on. Whereas if us as plugin developers place different action hooks, filters in the right places in the code, then a certain developer can just create a new plugin which hooks into this plugin, provided that our plugin is activated, and just insert his own functionality without bugging with the code of the original plugin. Now, as I was editing my presentation, I remember this article that I read some time ago from Nassim's blog, and he suggested that we use hooks instead of template tags. For example, if we want to have a small widget which prints tweets extracted from Twitter, one approach would be to just add a function verification to check if the function is actually defined, and then get to use it in order to avoid having errors generated. But a much cleaner and more cool way to do it would be to actually add this line of code within the plugin and implement the function over here, and then instruct the user to just add this line of code within the theme, and then whether the plugin is activated or not, the hook will just try to look for any functions that are trying to hook into this hook call. And if there's nothing there, nothing bad happens. Now, the second part of my presentation wants to go into using external services or third parties or libraries in order to extend the functionality that we are trying to implement. And my first idea would be to be very careful in the way we handle our remote calls. If we do curl calls, if we use the HTTP API of WordPress, just make sure that the way we use them does not get to stall the page load. We've seen plugins which try to fetch data from Google, Facebook, Twitter, and all the social media channels in order to aggregate the total number of shares. And of course, each server will have its own response time. And having a response time that's too high might end up leading in a PHP timeout and serving a blank page to the user. So the recommendation here would be to actually use cron jobs to fetch data from external services, from other servers, store it within options or transients or any other approach that we consider adequate, and then fetch it in the browser asynchronously so that the page loads fine, and we just basically, the last point that I put here would be useful in environments that use caching, HTML caching, so that, for example, if we have social media stats that update regularly, we make sure that we don't cache the social media shares at a certain moment in time, so that they are displayed in real time, and we load them asynchronously in the browser. Also, a very good approach would be to just let WordPress handle content and not make it also offer the functionality for optimizing images and sending emails and whatever, because certain hosting environments don't offer support, or the hosting servers are not necessarily optimized for doing these kind of tasks. And it might slow down the site, consuming resources that would otherwise be allocated to serving actual content to the users. Such services already exist, and provided that we have the resources necessary, I really recommend that we use them. Another issue that we've come across actually a few weeks ago was that plugin was using the ReCAPTCHA library from Google to add the new tick box that I'm not a robot, so you don't have to input what you see in an image. And the theme was also using the Google ReCAPTCHA library, but the old version, which just makes you insert what you see in the image. And these two versions of the plugin, of the library, were loaded from different places, one from the plugin and one from the theme. So we ended up having the same class being defined twice, which ended up not defining one of them, mainly the older one, thus rendering the functionality from the theme unusable. So the recommendation here would be that since we're the one developing the plugin or the theme, we're the one controlling the code, we're the one dictating when to switch from one version of the library to another, to actually go inside the library and prefix everything that we consider reaches the interface of that library, classes, functions, in order to make that library unique to the plugin that we use. And the third part of my presentation would go into analyzing some techniques that would be useful when we have caching on the site. Now, as I've already said, using asynchronous calls in order to load content is very useful. And one approach that we've had was to implement a plugin called Toplytics, which creates a list of the most popular articles from the blog by fetching data from Google Analytics. And based on the analytics, it creates the list in an ordered fashion. And we store the list, the ordered list, at a certain URL, which we implement using a rewrite rule. And then via Ajax calls, we just fetch the data and we make sure that in case we have two articles, and these articles are cached at two separate moments in time. One is cached 1 hour prior to the user reading the article, and one at the moment the user is actually reading the article. So the user navigates from one article to the next and then back. And in case the list has changed a long time, he will notice a small glitch since the cached versions contain different versions of the ordered list of the most read articles. So by loading these items asynchronously, we make them available in real time. As much as Ajax calls are useful, it would be really cool to not make abundant use of admin Ajax PHP, since these calls reach directly the part of the server that has to process all the PHP code. In case you have a caching layer, as we have at Presslabs, the caching layer serves directly the HTML cache, cached version of the site, without going to the level at which the PHP code is actually executed, thus not consuming resources that would otherwise not be needed to be used. So an alternative here would be to use custom rewrite rules and use template files, which we can include using the template include hook, thus making content available without the necessity of running through admin Ajax PHP at every page load. A lot of sites nowadays use infinite scroll, and it's a new way to look at user experience when the user is reading content on the site. And we've come across certain plugins which implement infinite scroll, or themes that implement infinite scroll, but instead of fetching data from URLs that are known to be standard in WordPress or would end up in a certain cache layer, they make calls directly to either admin Ajax PHP or by using get query vars, which might end up as to break the cache. So the recommendation here would be to just stick to, for example, if we want to implement infinite scroll on an archive page, just use the URL that would regularly be used for an archive page. And of course, make sure that your code is well integrated with database caching, so that you take advantage of the VP object cache, and also that by this reducing the number of queries that reach the database, and also taking it one step further by using extensions such as memcache, reducing the number of queries that get executed from one request to another, from one server request to another. One more idea would be that we restrain the size of the options that we store in the database. There are themes or plugins which choose to stick into one single array everything that has to do with the theme, including add codes, HTML code. This tends to occupy a lot of space. So the recommendation here would be to either split the option into multiple options, or maybe even better, use some custom post types in order to store that data which occupies a lot of space. The issue here is that large options might skip certain caching mechanisms, and also it oftentimes happens that plugin developers or theme developers don't pay attention to making their options not being required to be auto-loaded. So by having such a large option called upon each request, might end up flooding the server and taking it down in case of a boost of visuals from users. So the basic idea behind all these aspects that I've presented to you is that the cleaner the code that we write, the better the methods that we choose to use in our code, the less effort we have to spend offering support to the users that employ our functionality, and also the higher the trust that we get from the users that use our products. So now I'll ask you to come up with your experience, with your ideas when it comes to writing code that's universal. Okay, so I thank you very much for your attention.